This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 738, entitled, Men, don't just avoid monoconscious feminists, convert them to Biconsciousness. Description. This flyer claims that there's a much more effective strategy to make women nicer for men to be with than simply avoiding them, as 2/3 of young American men do today. That strategy is to convert monoconscious feminists to biconsciousness, in brackets, that is, teaching them masculist ideas, so that they lose their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness towards men, as taught them by feminism, once they realize that women oppress men far worse. Fire itself. Men, don't just avoid monoconscious feminists, convert them to Biconsciousness. By Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. If you're a biconscious masculist, in brackets, that is, by definition, you see that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, that is, that women oppress men too, and in fact far worse than vice versa, with women's horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes, such as women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, etc., which are far more serious than the relatively minor gender crimes that men commit against women, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, patriarchy, misogyny, etc. 2/3 of young men in the US today don't even date young women, in brackets, according to a Pew PW Research Center poll taken in 2022, which showed that 63% of young men between 18 and 30 see young women as undateable due to being too poisoned by feminism. Another recent Pew poll taken in 2020 found that 82% of politically democratic, with a capital D, women in the US feel that, quote, the US has work to do to give women equal rights with men. In other words, feminism has a very strong hold on American women's minds. And since these women know almost nothing about masculism, about men's lib, it's understandable why so many US women feel they are justified in being angry at men for the ways that men oppress women, which after all is what feminism preaches to women. That is, that gender oppression is a one-way street, and that women are the oppressed and men are the oppressors. Feminism says nothing, in capital letters, about how women oppress men. Such thinking is not even on feminist radar, so that monoconscious feminists are childishly irresponsible when it comes to thinking about how women's condition is partly women's fault. Instead, monoconscious feminists simply blame men for women's problems. It's therefore not surprising that most women feel they are justified in being misandrist, because they feel they have plenty of evidence to justify their misandry. But this misandry makes these women repulsive to men, especially young men, since young women are more likely to be feminists than their older sisters. Men, young men, don't want relationships with misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunts, and avoid them, letting them rot on the shelf by totally avoiding them. We are now seeing a flood of TikToks and YouTube shorts of young women in tears as they come to terms with the growing reality that young men are avoiding them, not approaching them, not dating them, and certainly not giving them their sperm. This flyer claims that this avoidance strategy of young men towards young women is not enough. It claims that a far better strategy for punishing women's misandry is not only to avoid them, but also to convert them to biconsciousness, since a biconscious feminist is much nicer to be with for a young man than a monoconscious feminazi bitch. Why? Because once a monoconscious feminist learns that gender oppression is a two-way street, by learning some masculism, learning of the horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes that women commit against men, her monoconscious feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, in brackets, for example, rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, patriarchy, misogyny, etc., gets cancelled by the far worse gender crimes that women commit against men, for example, the big three that the Masculists keep harping on. That is, women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, which are horrible, capital letters, decades-lasting gender crimes by women against men that cause Masculists to hate such gender criminal women who commit these horrible gender crimes against men. Once a former monoconscious feminist learns of Masculist ideas and becomes convinced that indeed women do oppress men far worse, then her former monoconscious feminist-based misandry appears deeply hypocritical to her, now that she sees that women oppress men far worse. So she softens her former anger at men, taught her by monoconscious feminism, so as to lower her self-sense as a hypocrite and a bigot. After 6 decades of feminist monopoly over gender politics, most women who are feminists have a really difficult time accepting that in reality gender oppression is a two-way street and that women oppress men worse, far worse. Such women usually suffer from cognitive dissonance when they hear Masculists telling them that they are MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots. These women have been so brainwashed by 6 decades of monoconscious feminism that gender oppression is a one-way street, that to be told the opposite is like going up to a priest and saying, "Mr. Priest, there's no God. Religions are human fictions. You have wasted your whole life." Unquote. Of course, such priests reject such claims, as similarly do most monoconscious feminists. This closed-mindedness of monoconscious feminists towards the Masculist claim that gender oppression is a two-way street, and that women actually oppress men worse with their big three, causes biconscious Masculists to see such women as bigots and hence contemptible. This flyer claims that once Masculist ideas are as widely known in society as feminist ideas, then such monoconscious feminist bigotry can be smashed by very angry biconscious Masculists hurling Masculist ideas at such women, forcing these women to become biconscious or be severely punished by men, masculisted men, by not getting one. At the time of writing, that's December 2025, most men are still ignorant of Masculist ideas, so their way of punishing monoconscious feminists by avoiding them does not change these women's monoconsciousness. If these women have not heard of Masculist biconsciousness, then there's no reason, no cause for them to change their opinions regarding men's oppression of women. But if nearly all men have become biconscious and harangue monoconscious feminists with verbally violent, ideologically hateful, Masculist rhetoric, then these women will get educated into Masculist thinking, since if they don't, they will be severely punished ideologically, brutally dumped by biconscious masculisted men who see such monoconscious feminists as hypocritical bigots who deserve to be dumped, to be spat on, as misandrist feminazi cunts who deserve to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable, lonely deaths, loveless, manless, sexless, babyless, spat at, viciously rejected, both socially and sexually. This flyer claims that this latter strategy of the Masculists is far more effective in making feminists nicer for men to be with than simply walking away from them, as most young men are doing today. This flyer claims that it's not enough to just walk away from such women, since just walking away does not convert such women into biconscious feminists. Thus these women remain feminazi bitchy with misandrist attitudes. Far better is to harangue these women with Masculist ideas, telling these women that if they don't become biconscious, that is, learn some Masculism, then they will be dumped, they will suffer, they will be cast out, they will be spat on, they will be socially and sexually rejected by men who will punish them severely. When nearly all men whom these monoconscious misandrist feminists come across don't tolerate these women's monoconsciousness, then these women will feel a very powerful moral pressure on them to convert themselves into biconscious feminists, or pay an extremely heavy price. Not only will they not get a man in their lives, but they will be cast out of society, rejected by men, and increasingly by female Masculists, who also see such monoconscious feminists as hypocrites, as bigots, as detestable. So, to young men reading/watching this, learn some Masculism, so that you are in a much stronger position to make women nicer for men to be with, by putting powerful moral pressure on women to become biconscious, rather than passively walking away from monoconscious feminist women. By converting such women to biconsciousness, such women lose their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness, because they see that women oppress men far worse. These women don't want a self-image of being a hypocritical bigot, so they lose their monoconscious anger at men due to their new biconscious female Masculist anger at women. The result is that millions of women, young women, become a lot nicer for men to be with, who will then vote, capital letters, with men for the men fairing of the gender laws, who will become FIPs, FIPs, financially independent persons, and not parasite of the money and labour of a man as an adult, who will help men push for the reform of the divorce courts, which butcher the lives of one father in 4. Millions of men every year due to the divorce courts accepting the fluffy model of women. A fluffy is a Masculist label for a traditional woman who expects to live off the money and labour of a man, thus manslaving him for decades, the worst of all gender crimes as seen by Masculists, who are abolitionists, seeing man's slavery as literally 1,000 times worse problem than was Negro slavery in the US in the early 1800s. Biconscious feminists will help men vote in the creation of GECs, GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male Masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes can be dealt with equally, which is far from being the case today in our current gynocentric world, gender politically speaking. The male half of these GECs will legislate the that's paternity rejection right, so that men have the same right as women have to reject an unwanted pregnancy that can ruin a woman's life. The fact that women have the mara and men don't have the para is the most blatant form of sexual discrimination that exists, that creates a sense of burning injustice amongst Masculists. The GECs will legislate the OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, that's obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block women's awful gender crime of paternity fraud, where the woman tells her man that the kid growing in her is his, when it isn't. When most women are biconscious, the current horrible phenomenon of the femmafia, that's feminist media mafia, can be overcome. The Femafia blocks publication of masculist ideas in the mainstream media because most journalists today are women, that is, monoconscious feminist women, who see any criticism of women as just more male misogyny and block publication of masculist ideas, which just increases the level of contempt that biconscious masculists have for monoconscious feminazis, who are thus only more hated. One does not censor half the world's population, as does the monoconscious feminist journalist majority. This is a very dangerous strategy on the part of the Femafia, which will cost them greatly when the majority of men become masculisted, who will then take their revenge on such women, effectively exterminating them slowly by forcing them to rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored by men, spat at for being monoconscious feminazi hypocrites, that is, hated and despised. So, summarizing, as stated in the very title of this flyer, to young men, don't just avoid monoconscious feminists, convert them to biconsciousness, which is a far superior strategy to make women much nicer for men to be with than just forcing them to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable, lonely deaths. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, click on the Masculist tab for 730 plus Masculist essays and their videos. Google the terms London Real and Hugo de Garis to see videos on Masculism at AI will kill 1 billion people, do we create our exterminators, ? Professor Hugo de Garis, London Real. Brackets, see the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segment, as well as